here's the question though. So what you had been doing at Belcore, what you'd started to do at Surety is you were dealing with the authentication of documents.
Yes.
Why didn't you try to expand it beyond just documents?
Well,
I mean, you have this product that has applicability in so many more things than that.
absolutely. And that's really partly answered when you look at the third paper.
Right,
The third paper that came out was about bit strings.
right,
And that was the paper that for the first time moved beyond the idea of this backbone that simply authenticates private documents into something that comes much closer to being a public ledger.
right,
Okay? Because we were embedding into what then would become more of a ledger things that would be publicly available.
right.
And so we did try to push the envelope, but let me just give you an analogy for situating yourself in the technology times we were living in.
Right.
You know, you're still talking about dial-up modems. You're still talking about, hard disk drives that held tens of megabytes.
Well, I remember my first hard drive had 5, and I was thrilled. I
Right.
thought unlimited space.
Right. I remember, and this is a few years earlier, the first issue of Macworld came out, and on the back of it, it has this ad, okay, and it says bottomless storage, and the reason they called it bottomless was they were selling 10 and 20 megabyte disk drives.
And that was
meaning you're never going to run out of space.
right.
And so fast forward to the fact that you've got something like Bitcoin, which has a shared ledger that's larger than 200 gigabytes.
Right, it is.
Okay.
And growing.
Replicated- Right, and it only grows. Replicated in
Tens of
thousands, if not
thousands.
tens of thousands of locations, and the fact that that size of a ledger
Has to be
in a sense
replicated
what's
all the
required.
time. I know.
Okay? That was just completely beyond our, ability to think in those terms. We were trying everything we could to make the fundamental backbone record as small as we possibly could.
Right.
It was also at a time where the whole notion of an internet where you could just assume peer-to-peer connectivity with anyone that you wanted to communicate with.
It was in its infancy.
In fact, I still remember even when we founded Surety, our first major investor, who himself was a very sophisticated technologist, I told him that we would need to gain peer-to-peer access to his company so that they could use it for
Sure.
real-time timestamping. He goes, there's no way in the world I'm going to open up a port, on one of my company's servers to anyone that wants to come in. Think of, what a disaster that would be.
Right.
Well, of course, that's what the internet is.
It's what it is.
And so the mindset, the world that we occupied was so different. It's not unlike, you remember with the Y2K problem.
Right.
It just seems so laughable now because why was there a Y2K problem? Because
We didn't put
we
19.
had so little memory to work with
Right.
and so little storage to work with that it really mattered instead of saying 1956 to just say 56.
Right.
Okay. Well, that was the kind of memory and connectivity and storage world that we were living in.
Right.
And so some of these things, they just don't come out in their full expansiveness until you see exponential decrease in the cost of and exponential increase in the size of or capacity of
Right.
bandwidth and storage. And
Well,
memory,
technology
processing
is
power.
absolutely deflationary because you get more for less always.
Right.
And so it's very interesting.
It's deflationary in the producer and consumer
Correct.
world.
That's correct.
It's marvelously expansionary in the inventor's world.
Correct.
Because each successive wave of improvement enables rethinking so much about how the world is going to how people are going to interact.
Correct.
So it's just this it's this gift that keeps on giving of, new vistas, new ways to think about things in an information-rich, bandwidth-rich, computational resource-rich world.
Right. As an example, I'm just going to make this analogy is that so often, especially young learners of all technology, don't realize how computational expansion has actually occurred. I mean, everyone's probably familiar with the cards that open up and play a little music. The computational aspect of those cards exceed what was the computational power that put men on the moon.
Yeah, and that's the right analogy.
I mean, something we throw away, and yet it is so powerful compared to what we had.
The computers that were ran on Apollo is the right benchmark to compare those two.
It's absolutely fascinating. Now, one of the things that you did when you had Surety, of course, is that instead of calling it a blockchain system, which is something that you tried to use before, you called this a hash chain linking. Was that just marketing terminology, trying to figure out a way to do it? I mean, it seems to me that from today's viewpoint, those are almost interchangeable words.
Sure. I mean, as I said before, what we had was a cryptographically linked chain of blocks that were widely distributed. So it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to call it a blockchain. But if that was the only thing we did wrong, Stuart and I, in trying to make a go of this thing, things would be very different. We made all sorts of mistakes. We had no idea what we were doing. And so narrow branding and narrow marketing was just one of a long litany of...
Well, who knew that blockchain was going to be the terminology?
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Nobody knew.
I do want to be clear, okay? And I say this with all deference to those that have made great contributions forward. We knew we were onto something very big. We knew that whether by luck or intelligence, we had run across something that was, because of its democratizing effect,
right,
because of its decentralizing effect,
right,
because it removed power from a single authority and distributed it, we knew that there would be societal implications.
Right. Now, coming back to the other considerations or other things that you could do with this technology, a couple of years after you wrote your second paper, in June actually of 1996, the NSA actually published a paper called How to Make a Mint, the Cryptography of an Anonymous Electronic Cash. Now, were you aware of that paper at the time?
Well, I was certainly caught up in the zeitgeist because that was not the only paper. And just to pick one person as an example.
I picked these people simply because this is the NSA.
It is the NSA.
I mean,
okay?
Why would they be writing this, first of all?
Oh, well, they give them a little bit of latitude. How do you get smart, creative people to work someplace if part of it doesn't give you a little bit of room to run?
Okay.
But that whole community, and David Chaum is the name that
sure,
I associate it with because...
Well, actually, he wasn't one of the three authors.
I understand.
Right,
but
right.
What I'm saying is...
At the same time, he was doing his papers too.
There were many of us that were excited about the potential for cryptography to create a new set of trust foundations
right,
for society in general.
Right.
And again, I was very much inspired by many of the things that he and others wrote. It was a terrific time to start sort of reimagining, re-engineering the social connections of the world.
Right.
So, yeah, that was inspirational, but there were lots of papers, lots of interesting things.
Sure there was.
And I think that actually, and again, perhaps I'm jumping too much, that actually leads to understanding better where Bitcoin was coming from, what it was trying to achieve, and why it was initially successful, not because of all of its technical design decisions, but in some cases in spite of them.
Right. Well, there was a need. I mean, the environment that of when that paper came out was as we had just had the collapse of Lehman Brothers. We had Bear Stearns sold
Which was
for
one of
nothing.
the early funders of Surety, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Actually, one of their senior people was one of the early
Sure.
funders.
So this was it was a financial nightmare at the time, and we didn't know. You know, looking forward, I mean, looking back, we're going, well, of course it's going to work itself out. But at the time, there was a lot of question about the future, and so that was the environment that this came out with. I mean, did you find though that the Satoshi paper actually was kind of like late to the game, since there were so many papers before
That is absolutely the right way to frame this discussion, because it's important to understand that Satoshi comes at the end, if you will, of a long line of efforts
Right.
to create
digital
cash.
His was published 12 years after the NSA published theirs, which
Right.
David had written a couple before.
Right.
And
right.
I mean, like,
And so I think that's really the right context to think about the early success of Bitcoin. Namely, here's a community that has been wandering in the wilderness for a long, long time, hoping for something that would actually stick.
right.
And in that sense, I don't mean this as a discredit to Satoshi. In that sense, something that even started to come close was sort of quickly anointed as a solution.
Right.
Whereas if there hadn't been this community looking for so long for something to work, I don't think we would have seen the early uptake that Bitcoin had that was essential for it reaching out to a wider audience.
Sure. You said early on that you were not originally aware of when the paper was published, and it was really afterwards when people were both emailing you and sending you physical letters asking you.
That I actually looked at the paper.
Right. So when you finally got to that paper, what was your first thoughts? I mean, did you like look at it and go, this is, not really much different. Maybe this proof of work concept on consensus is interesting. So what was that initial feeling you got?
Well, I can first remember reading through the paper and saying, yeah, and then sort of saying, where's the rest? Is this all there is?
Yeah, 9 pages.
Is this?
And the last page is citations.
And there were some great advances in the paper. Okay, and
So what were these surprises?
Well, let me talk about what I thought was the really good stuff.
Okay.
Because we were all interested in the whole digital cash problem.
Right.
But neither Stuart or I ever thought that what we did would have anything to do with that. And here's why. As originally proposed, these digital cash questions were trying to do two things. One, there was this sense that cash did not carry a trace, a record of who it went from.
Correct.
And yet
It's anonymous.
It carried its own integrity with it.
That's correct.
Okay. And second, by that reason, it did not have a double spend problem. And so anonymity and the double spend were the issues that the community collectively at the time was thinking were what had to be solved in order to create digital cash.
Right.
Okay. And we did not see our work as having applicability to that. Now, let's talk about Bitcoin.